Hey, Jerry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. It's nice to be here with you.
The Beatles Recording Techniques. What a great read. This is a great read for music fans like myself, but also for those who are looking to create that iconic Beatles sound. You know, musicians, engineers, producers. It's a must read. Before I ask you about the book, though, tell us about yourself, your background in music, producing, engineering, and your work on the Beatles recording reference manuals, too, because those came before this.
They did come before this. Lifelong involvement in music. I mean, since I can remember, I've been recording since I was 15 or 16 years old. Started cross-wiring cassette decks together to be able to do this simulated multi-tracking sort of thing, tape on tape sorts of recordings, and so I've always been involved in engineering, producing, and mixing and making music. I'm a multi-instrumentalist. So all this is just baked into my DNA. And the Beatles also baked into my DNA for as long as I can remember. There was a point about 12 or 13 years ago. Now I think we're coming on that kind of time frame where I had some time on my hands, and I was reflecting on how the Beatles did their thing in the studio. Because you'd always get asked whenever I was in a recording session with another artist, they would want a Beatles sound one way or another. You know, give me that McCartney bass sound, or give me that Ringo drum sound. And when you're in a service industry, you always say, "You got it, I'll do that for you." And then you had to figure out how it was done, and that. Going down that rabbit hole led to the development of the content for the Beatles recording reference manuals, which was about an 11-year project where I researched every bit of gear that was used in every session, every bit of work that was done in every session, and basically reconstructed the Beatles' entire catalog from first take to remix on every song. So you follow them out from the first time they hit tape with it till it's mixed on a song by song basis, and then every single session in the studio, what they did, who was there, the studio gear that was used, the instrumentation that was used, microphones, absolutely everything that was done on it. And all of this isn't speculation. This is all done. I like to say chapter and verse in terms of it's all very well researched.
Man, I could imagine. 11 years, you said?
It's about 11 years on the 5 books. Yeah.
Wow.
It just turned out that way. It took me longer to write about what they did than they actually spent doing it.
Yeah. When did you first realize that you had an ear for this type of thing? You know, when you were a kid, were you listening for certain things when you heard music?
Yeah, I definitely always had an ear that would dissect music, and I think that's a musician's ear in general, because you're like, if you're a bass player, you're always trying to hear the bass part. You're a piano player, you're trying to hear the piano part. Et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of develop that ear as a musician. Funny enough, I was, in my pre-music years, I want to say I was no more than 10 or 11 years old, and I would diagram recordings. I had this like fantasy of making recordings, and I knew enough about what was going on even at that age to know that they were doing multi-tracking. And so I would draw, like they're in the reference manuals, I'd draw boxes and say, this is what's going to be on this part of the tape.
That's amazing.
And
and how long before you realized, not everybody thinks like this? My friends aren't doing this stuff.
never really crossed my mind. And I've been really, blessed in my life to always be surrounded by musicians and really talented people, and people that I can learn from and that are generous with their knowledge, that help me learn how to do this stuff. It's nice to be able, through the Beatles, to give back. It really is.
Yeah. So tell us about the book, The Beatles Recording Techniques. How's it laid out? Because you talk about diagrams, but it's also written in a way that, like I said, just music fans like myself, it's a fascinating read to get the stories and your thoughts behind songs. So how's it laid out? What can people expect when they get this book?
So the idea behind the book is truly primarily targeted toward musicians, producers, engineers, but it does overlap for hardcore Beatles fans that want to know a little bit more details about how they made the music. Um, so uh, what I go through in it is I talk about the tools that are in the studio, and modern equivalents to the tools that people working in a digital recording environment now can utilize to mimic the physical environment at EMI Studios, which is now Abbey Road. Uh, I start with that. I discuss all of the instruments used in every era of the Beatles recordings, so you know their toolkit. So that's the first stop, is understanding the basic toolkit that'll allow you to start to get there. But then you have to understand why the Beatles music sounds the way it does. And there were certain kind of key production and arrangement decisions that George Martin made along with the band that gave you the kind of the vibe of the Beatles in any one era that they were working in, be it the early era up through Rubber Soul, be it a middle era up through Revolver, the psychedelic era of Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, their transition to 8-track with the White Album, and then the late era of Let It Be and Abbey Road. Each of those eras has certain kind of key sounds that you can identify if you really look into it, the ways that they looked at making the music. And there were also ways that they recorded the music. And so I discuss those things. And then I get into the nitty-gritty of mic positions for different, for recording every single kind of tone that they recorded, from acoustic instruments to amplifiers to just down the line. And I talk about how you can achieve these things at home. And finally, I get into how you mix and master emulating the way that they did it at Abbey Road. And the bottom line for working like the Beatles is to be working with some pretty significant limitations. And in a modern era, these limitations have to be self-imposed, because we have so much freedom now in making music that we don't have to. But if you want to get that sound, I describe to you the ways in which they were limited and how they worked those limitations to get that magic that we love.
It is interesting, the limitations that leads to using your imagination, creativity, come up with something. Don't lean on the equipment so much. Just make sure you use your imagination. And that's what I love about the old school recordings, especially. Actually, I wanted to ask you about the early Beatles recordings at EMI in London, because it was an interesting comment you made in chapter 4. It's regarding the recording process at EMI back in the mid 60s when the Beatles recorded music there. Now, producers were forced to think ahead and be ready due to the tight scheduling process. So it's true, you had to record both sides of a single in 3 hours?
That's pretty much what was expected in the earliest part of the Beatles' career. You could think of EMI as a factory, a music factory is the way I describe it. And like any factory, they have their tools, they have their established techniques that help them do the work that they need to do, which is produce hit records. So the band's role in that is you show up ready to record, and you show up ready to finish a song. And in many cases, 2 songs. You're getting a side done in the block of time that you've got there, which is each studio is booked in 3-hour blocks. So now to prepare for that, the producer of the session would know that X band is coming in, and X band is composed of, let's say in the Beatles case, I've got 2 guitarists, a bass guitarist, and a drummer. And so he would have to make a note for the engineering staff of all the microphones he needed, tape machines he needed, outboard gear he needed, like compressors and limiters. If he wanted access to an echo chamber, or if he wanted access to plate reverbs or any special effects that they had, which was very limited. But he still had to make a note that he wanted this, because in the background, they had to plumb all of these things in. These required hardwired connections between gear that sometimes wasn't in the same room. They would use a patch bay that worked across the entire studio complex to be able to access gear that they wanted to use on a session, or they would have to know to bring it into the studio and plug it in. And so all of this in advance.
And they also recorded live. That was the thing back at the time, like mostly just one take, maybe an overdub.
Well, one take, not so much.
Not so much,
Sometimes,
but okay.
sometimes.
But the idea was, let's try to record it live. Like nowadays, you can multi-track recording. You can add this later. You can do a little overdub here.
It was, I mean, it was always the case in even before the Beatles that when you're making a recording and you were working on tape, so this, I'm not talking about direct to disc, I'm talking about working on tape now, that you were always trying to make like the ideal, like the perfect performance. And that wasn't always a live thing. And there are a handful of cases, certainly in the Beatles catalog, where take one is the song, or one full take is the song. But there's equally loads of songs that were made in the early days that were the result of edits of the best performances that were then, the tape was sliced and pasted together.
Spliced together, yeah.
Spliced together.
I'm old enough to remember my old radio days, splicing the
yes,
tape together,
yeah,
which is not easy to do.
No,
It's not easy.
And don't mess it up.
Yeah.
because you don't get it back. But again, the idea was always to capture the best performance that you could get. Sometimes that was live, sometimes that involved multiple takes. And even from the beginning, they were doing overdubs. There's such a thing, and I describe in the book, of a mono to mono overdub. And so there's mono to mono overdubs. There were twin track to twin track, or twin track stereo to twin track stereo overdubs. 4-track, of course, overdubs in that. And then they also got into what are called tape reduction remixes, where if you run out of room on a tape, then you'd send all that to another tape and mix it at that time to a fewer number of tracks to open up more tracks for more work. Again, these are really serious limitations compared to today's, endless track counts that engineers get to work with. But making those choices, making those commitments and decisions all along the way is what gave the Beatles sound its signature.
Yeah, a lot of those recordings, like the old Led Zeppelin tracks too, where you hear the mistakes, they keep it in.
Well, sometimes
authentic.
with that, well, and sometimes with that, again, back in the day, perfection wasn't as much the thing as the overall feel. And if I've got 98% of a great take of Black Dog, I'm not going to redo the whole song because there's one part where there's just a little bit of a drag on the groove.
Yeah, or a squeak of the pedal. Bottom squeak.
Yeah, I'm not. You're just not going to do it. And there's lots of questionable performances if you go deep into the Beatles work, that were exposed in when the Rock Band stems came out for that game, and you listen to some of the raw performances that are nested in there, and you're like, wow, they kept that. But you have to remember that they were recording to it and listening to it in context. And if it worked in context, then it's good enough, and you move on. And if it felt right, had the right atmosphere to it, then that's something you keep. And a producer's job is to be observant for the takes that you're making that have that little bit of magic to them.
Yeah.
Right? Everything, it's accurate enough, but if I'm gonna fault one way or another, it's gonna be the take with a feel is gonna always, with most I think seasoned producers, the take with feel is always going to be the take that you want over the take that's perfect. So, and there's a lot of that in the Beatles catalog. There's a
Yeah.
lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. George Martin is a genius. Is he the
Well,
I mean, is he the first guy that you took to as far as production? Because there's so many of them. There's so many greats out there.
oh, certainly, again, my earliest memories, my earliest musical memories are Beatle memories. Shortly after, when I really started thinking about music, then I developed a vocabulary of producers and sometimes even producers and engineers, from an early age. And so, you've got like Gus Dudgeon, who did all the early Elton John stuff, is just another just off the charts genius producer. He did Space Oddity for David Bowie, as well. Yeah, a producer who has ears and taste and can help an artist bring the vision forward. It's part of the formula.
Well, and I'm going to get into some of the specifics of George Martin as we go through these songs. But what makes a great producer? Because I know a lot of times George less is more approach with him. Like he'd let the song breathe a little bit more, or he'd have the guts to tell the guys in the band, no guitars on this, no, check the
Well,
egos at the door. But that kind of
George,
thing, you have to make those decisions.
yeah, I mean, George Martin's self-penned book is All You Need Is Ears. And it's not quite all you need is ears, but it's an excellent point. The idea is, because for working in music, it all ends up here. It ends up in our ears. It ends up in our it ends up in our ears. And so you're understanding that and understanding what causes confusion when you're hearing it, how clarity is managed, how confusion is managed, how complexity is managed, how simplicity is managed. Understanding those aspects of sound is what makes a great producer. And then also understanding what emotes and connects with the audience, so that you're helping the artist tell their story. You're helping them project their story to their audience. Those are the hallmarks of a really great producer. Martin had a kind of an ethos in his production technique that I describe as a place for everything and everything in its place. And that's a very exacting sort of ethos. And as you mentioned, you get to play guitar here, George or John, but when we get to this bridge before the second chorus, we don't need to hear that guitar part anymore. Stop. Don't play that. And it isn't play something else. Like I've got to have guitar going all the time. It's, what's going to fit there might be a piano. What's going to fit there might be an organ. And he would always weave that arrangement and that dance in a very effective way. Surprisingly few elements make up a lot of, especially the early Beatles catalog, make a very full sound in the early Beatles catalog. Surprisingly limited number of instruments are doing a lot of work, but it's
Yeah.
because it's how they're used.
Yeah, boy, did you see the interview George Martin did with Brian Wilson maybe 10 years ago or so, where
I don't know that I
two
did.
geniuses in the same room, and he's asking Brian about how he put together good vibrations. It's just that amazes me what a producer is hearing. Or like Brian Wilson, he's a musician, but he's got a producer's mind and what they hear and the absence. Like I'm trying to remember who the producer is who prefers sometimes when on the drums no cymbals at all, just dry, just like, why do they think of that? It's just fascinates me, those things.
Yeah, and in some cases it's to it's to achieve effect, right? You're making these choices to achieve specific effects. Um, uh, back in the Martin era, back in the Beach Boys era, when Brian Wilson was working in California, they had such limited toolkits to do these things that they had to really think it out. They really had to work out what they were gonna do and how they were gonna get there. Good Vibrations took 6 months to record.
Amazing.
Yeah, one song took 6 months to record. And it shows. It doesn't show in a labored way, like there's that joke where acting should be effortless. And if you see an actor, you go, wow, you left everything on the screen. That's not a compliment. It's not a compliment. The idea is that we experience this music without really even thinking about it, but it just hits us. And those 6 months on Good Vibrations was spent crafting something that just floors us.
Yeah.
But we're not thinking about all of the heavy lifting that went into to getting us there. In the same way with Sergeant Pepper, or frankly, the work of the White Album, which is extensive.
Yeah.
But you hear it and you don't experience it like that.
Well, it is interesting too. Sergeant Pepper's influenced by Brian and the Beach Boys.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
we'll get to. Let's actually go. What I did was I put together a playlist of the songs that I want to ask you about. I picked a song, maybe two out of each album, because otherwise, if I did more, you'd be here all night, and I don't want to keep you. I appreciate you spending your time talking about this. So I picked one song, but anything you want to add about the albums as a whole, feel free. But pick the song. And people can listen along on the show notes page. Click the link. You can hear these songs. So we start with Please Please Me, 1963. I saw her standing there. So you say George Martin focuses on the beat and clean guitars. George Harrison's simple guitar fills span the gaps between vocals, and his solo is bathed in a crisp echo, a great effect. So how are they getting that echo to sound so crisp?
Well, it's echo chamber is what they're using at the time. That was one of the primary effects that they had was simply an echo chamber, and they were able to put an equalizer on the echo chamber, meaning they could change the tone of the echo. It could be dark and heavy, or it could be light and crisp. And in this case, they gave us a really light reverb, but that gives us it reinforces kind of the upbeat nature of that particular brand of rock and roll that we hear there. And again, there are simple choices in the way that the song is arranged, where you've got Harrison filling those gaps. I tend to think of the approach that Martin uses. I step back a couple of generations in recording and think of like single mic recordings. And if anyone's familiar or seen movies with bluegrass bands, or even some contemporary bluegrass bands, you'll see them grouped around a microphone. And when it's time to sing, the singer steps up to the microphone and sings. When it's time for the mandolin solo, the singer steps back, the mandolin player steps up, right? And that's the sort of dance that Martin does in his production in a lot of cases with the early Beatles. Is what's important now, bring it forward. Not important, get it out of the way. And that's the atmosphere of a lot of the Please Please Me album and the With the Beatles album. They're very live feeling, even again if they are still recorded very traditionally in terms of using multiple takes, overdubs, what they called edit pieces. Like they get 2/3 through the song, like the back half of it wasn't quite strong enough. They'd start with the back third of the song and record that, and they'd slice it together. And they're doing this without a click track. They're matching tempos just because they know the tempo they play the song at.
Yeah, and for those not familiar with the click track, that's just something to keep everybody on that beat,
on the same beat, on the same groove.
Yeah.
It didn't exist.
Yeah.
So that blows my mind when I really think about it. Is these guys are doing take after take after take, and if you've had a chance to listen to any of the outtakes that are out there on the internet, the bootleg outtakes or session tapes, and you hear take after take after take of some Beatles songs,
Yeah.
and they're just
Now,
always like right on.
did they have that relationship, that chemistry with George from the get go? They had respect for him, and whatever he said, yeah, we'll do whatever you say. And actually, I'm just thinking now, was he hired by the label? How did that
Well,
work?
he ran Parlophone.
Okay,
So
okay,
yeah, he ran Parlophone, and then it was an EMI subsidiary label. Okay, so it's owned Parlophone owned by EMI, though the least of their labels. And he ran the label.
let's give this
Um,
little band a shot.
yeah, well,
Put them
eventually,
on the
yes,
least of the labels.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. There's a whole story behind all that.
yeah,
But uh, uh, he was he produced them by default because he was like he was the lead producer. Um, so there was that aspect of it. When he realized he could get a better financial deal, he left Parlophone and started AIR, and he leased his service. He hired his services then to do the work on the Beatles album and got a better rate.
okay.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah, so
that
they
was his
took to him right
relationship.
away. Like there was that chemistry right there. Like this
Yeah,
guy knows what he's doing. Let's do what he
well, I
says.
mean, he did know what he was doing.
Yeah,
He had successful recordings and continued to have successful recordings around the Beatles as well. So yeah, he was a guy who knew how to make a hit record and make good records. And he was surrounded by professionals at EMI that also made. That's all they did. That's what they did every day.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Now that second album is interesting because, and we're talking with the Beatles, also
mhm.
released in 1963. The drums and percussion sounds are surprisingly upfront on this album, you say. And I was going through each track, and I think you can hear it the most probably on Devil in Her Heart. You hear a lot of the percussions,
Yeah, yeah,
but the
yeah.
whole album it really stands out. And you note in the book that drums and percussions are far more forward in relation to what we hear on Please Please Me. Why do you think that is? Was that a conscious decision?
I think it was. The engineer Norman Smith had a lot to do with shaping the tone of the live recordings, and uh, when you all the choices that you make as an engineer about mic placements, for instance, all of that translates, but it's also and in particular the initial choices that are being made about the sound around that really drive in these early recordings, because these are twin track recordings. These are only taking up 2 tracks of audio tape at this point. Even if they're doing overdubs, they're still 2 tracks audio tape, and in many cases, the entire backing band is on one audio track. So guitars, bass, and drums are all on one track of tape.
That's not done
So
anymore, right?
no,
I mean,
and for people that aren't aware of that, if you're doing that and you're making that commitment, then the decisions you made are made right then and there. Everything you're deciding about the sound happens right there when it's going to tape. And so the choices that Norman Smith drove through, again, his mic placements and his initial balances of tone and volume relationships. That's what gave it the sound. And in this era, he had the drums were hotter than they were in the Please Please Me era.
so this is a question on him. This may be a stupid question, but I'm going to put it. So all of these albums, they're in stereo years later. So those instruments, were they all also in one channel, or were they able to
Yeah,
separate?
yeah,
Okay.
one track, one
One
channel.
channel. That's it. Okay.
That's it. Which is why a lot of Beatles snobs, which I can I can be I can be many days of the week. We'll say that the mono mixes of the early work are the best
I was
mixes.
going to ask you, yeah,
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. With only 2 tracks and recorded not in stereo, meaning not recorded with a full 180-degree sound field, but instead recorded as 2 individual mono tracks. Getting a good stereo image is kind of tough.
Yeah, and there was no need to back then. It was for AM radio, right?
Their focus was AM radio. Their focus was also the consumer focus in the UK was what they called uh, the record players were called dansets. They were just little, home turntables with a single speaker, right? And so that's your consumer format. And just like today, if you're you mix or you develop the music to the format. The dominant format is still stereo today, but there are specific recordings that are prepared and mixed for surround sound, and now for Atmos, which has not only
Yeah,
surround but has height to it.
right. Atmos.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah,
Now I believe Apple only has music in Atmos. Is that? I believe so. I'm trying to remember. If you have Apple or iTunes or whatever, that's the only way you're going to hear. I don't know, but
yeah.
yeah,
Well, and you need an Atmos system, which
yeah,
are
yeah. Okay,
kind of pricey.
yeah. But I do remember the surround sound. But you had to have the setup to hear it. But like Dark Side of the Moon was released in
Yeah,
surround
and the
sound.
idea was that the people that had, well, the earliest iteration of that I lived through was quad, and so four speakers, and I remember some early like Who mixes and things that were in quad, and yeah, and those are a lot of fun. But again, do these things hold on? Do they? Who knows in 20 years if we'll even be talking about any of these kind of formats. But stereos have long shelf life, and stereo for the high fidelity end of it is still kind of a benchmark piece. But in the Beatles era, it was mono. Up
Yeah,
up
yeah.
through up through 1968, it was mono was dominant. Now quickly in and after 68, stereo became the format, and they left mono in the dirt.
Because of FM radio, right?
Yeah, FM radio.
Yeah, yeah. But I can see why you would prefer the mono over the stereo remix, because it's kind of like those old classic black and whites when in the 80s they all of a sudden colorized them. It's like It's a Wonderful Life in color. No, it wasn't made for that to begin with. So I could see that. 1964 is A Hard Day's Night. Of course, the most iconic track is the title track. An endless debate among Beatles fans about what comprises the first epic chord of this song. So what are fans saying it is? And what is it that we're really hearing? This is kind of like a Phil Spector type of thing. It's like a combination of things all at once.
Well, it is, and this is again one of the great aspects of George Martin as an arranger is he realized that in many cases it's a composite tone that gets your attention more than any one individual tone or any one individual part. So so this big crashing chord at the beginning of a hard day's night is there are multiple instruments doing it. I'd have to open up my own book to see what those are anymore. But you got at least a couple guitars going there. I forget if you've got a piano that's adding to it.
It sounds like it.
Well, yeah, but sound
Deceiving.
is deceiving. It's so deceiving. Um, but the idea here is the layering of tones makes them more interesting. It makes them more interesting than makes them more memorable. Uh, in the solo for A Hard Day's Night, we have it's well known for a lot of Beatles fans that was recorded at half the speed that it's played back at, because it was a little bit difficult for Harrison to do the triplets and do those consistently. So that's an overdub. And at the same time that was being played, Martin played the exact same line on the piano. And so now we have the guitar, so we hear the guitar, but the guitar we're hearing is a guitar that's composited with a piano. And he did that in many instances across their catalog, where you have And it's an orchestral technique. It's an orchestral technique where you'll have multiple instruments doing a unison part, and they're taking up a different textural aspect of it, and they're taking up a different part of the frequency spectrum. So, the texture of a piano, let's just for giggles say that in the Hard Day's Night opening chord that is a piano there. Okay. And again, it's in a book somewhere that I wrote.
Buy a copy and you'll find out.
Buy a copy, everybody. um, the texture of the percussion of a piano, piano is a percussion instrument. So the hammer of a piano striking the string gives you an initial hit that is unlike a guitar getting strummed. And now you have the combination of those. I've got strum and I've got a punch of percussion. And Martin did those sorts of things all the time.
Yeah. And was it his decision for that opening, that dramatic opening? Because it's such a great effect to it. Whereas if you just started right in with, it's been a hard day, just right in with that, it's not the same as that.
Yeah, the narrative is that they knew that this was going to be the opening song for the movie, and they did want something powerful.
Right.
So yeah, there's intention behind it. And this is another lesson of the Beatles is you make decisions with intent. I'm not doing this. I'm not just going to doodle along on my guitar and then something cool. Oh, great. It's what do I want to do with it? And now I'm going to try to do that with it. So you start in with an intent, with an idea, and you try to fulfill that idea. It might not be a good idea, but you're not just going in and you're not like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what's going to stick. That was never the Beatles' way. They had definite ideas of what they wanted to do. Even if those ideas changed, when they changed, there was a new definite idea of what they wanted to do. And then they would do the work, and they were very disciplined at it, of preparing to get that on tape.
So the opposite, did they ever have any happy accident moments?
Oh,
like, whoa, that's cool.
Yeah, lots of them.
Keep it.
There's lots of them. Probably, famously in the White Album era, you've got Long, 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 the Harrison song. And at the end of it, where it's getting all kind of freaky and acidy, as the song's tailing out, you hear this rattle going on. You hear an organ part come up, and then this rattling noise. Well, that rattle is a wine bottle that was sitting on top of a Leslie speaker cabinet for the organ. And when you heard it hit a certain note on the organ, the wine bottle rattled. And they heard that and went, and of course they stopped. But they didn't go like, hey, take the wine bottle off. They went, hey, throw a mic on that wine bottle.
Brilliant. Oh, I love it.
So yeah, and again, it's part of the engineer's art, as far as I'm concerned, is you have your ear out for these things. And if they work in an interesting way, or they work in a way that exposes more emotion, or you think is going to connect the listener more to the track, then you follow that. You follow that, you embrace that accident.
Was it you, Padgham, when he was working on the Peter Gabriel album, where Phil Collins plays on a track and he stumbles on the Phil Collins sound, the snare sound? They're just messing around, tweaking with the board.
I think you're talking about Face Value with In the Air Tonight.
Well, that sound originated when Phil just sat in on a track for Peter on a song off of Peter's solo album. And Phil was just in there messing around on the drums, playing around, and they were messing around with the mixer, just getting things set up. And that tone kicked in, and Phil was like, whoa, what is that? What are you doing? Don't touch it, And then he used that for the rest of the 80s, right into the 90s. It was just like the definitive sound.
Yeah. So what
It's like
that
a
tone,
certain gate reverb, like a
well, what that sound was is they had most most professional studios, you have what's called a talkback system. And so in the studio, there's just a mic hanging there that you can talk and communicate to the engineer through. And the engineer will hit a button and talk to the studio, and you release it, and it activates the talkback mic.
right.
Well, that mic has a noise gate on it, so when you don't hear a bunch of noise out of the studio, you only hear when people are talking. Well, that mic was left open, and that's what captured the drum sound. It's this just massive room sound that's going through a gate.
Yes.
And but when they figured out they liked it, then overnight they had the technician and they had the tech for the studio get in and wire that into the board
Yes.
so they could just access it anytime they wanted it, and it was no longer an accident. It
And by the
was
way, it's Intruder. That's a song. I just looked it up
okay.
quickly because that's on Peter's album, Melt.
No, okay.
Well, I don't know. That's the one where his face
Yeah,
is
his
melting.
face is melting.
Yeah. But that's those happy
Melt,
accidents. It's like, whoa.
scratch,
Yeah, right, right.
car.
Yes. But yeah, those happy accidents, man. Like the Zeppelin one on Whole Lot of Love, that one part where you hear Robert Plant fate before he sings Way Down Inside, you hear him singing it prior to him singing it, but very low, faded. And that was just an accent of the tape, I think was
Well, often you'll have guide tracks
yes.
where you'll sing all, where if you're recording a band live, and the Beatles have this is again, if you listen deep into and have access to high quality Beatles performances, you can hear in some cases way out in the background, you'll hear John singing or Paul singing, and they're cueing the band as you're playing live. So if you're doing Sergeant Pepper, they might go, "It was 20 years ago," and they're off mic, and now okay, we're done. And then the second verse, they'll sing the first part of the second verse, so we know we're at the second verse, and we know we're at the chorus, and that's just a way that you play together live when you're tracking without a vocal.
And I do remember back in the radio days when we had reel to reel and carts, you would if you recorded a commercial on a cart and that commercial its run is ended, so now it's time to put something over it, you'd put it over the magnet thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you just keep going back and forth until it was gone. But sometimes if you didn't do it enough, there's a little bit of a faded, you hear a little bit of the faded like remnants of that audio still there. And that I think is also part of that Whole Lot of Love story too.
But
That's old school, man. That's just you can't get that. I mean, imagine that you stumble on something like that.
And it's funny that I can guarantee you, Zeppelin never wanted us to hear that.
Right.
They never wanted to hear. This is
And that was Eddie Kramer, by the way, too. I think that was
Kramer
producing.
did a lot of their work. Yeah. This is it's one of my quibbles with the 50th anniversary sets that Giles Martin and Sam Oaknell mixed. This idea that we're hearing all of this stuff that they never really intended us to hear. A big example would be the 50th anniversary remix of A Day in the Life, where we hear Mal counting to 24.
Mal Evans, yeah.
And we're not meant to hear that. We're not meant to hear that. Beatles didn't want Mal's voice on A Day in the Life.
Man, I'd love to sneak into the photo shots. He would have been happy to know his voice is now.
Yeah.
In the recording. But yeah, it wasn't intended. So
no, it's not intended at all.
It's like George Lucas Star Wars stuff, right? When he redid all the Star Wars. What are you doing? Yeah. It's perfect the way it is.
Well, yeah, and again, we as fans we hear these things. To us, they're little Easter eggs, and so I get that those things are brought forward out of historical interest, but uh, again, the Beatles never intended you to hear, Mao. They never intended you to hear uh, on the new red and blue mixes, the red one in particular. Um, Actually, I think it might be I Saw Her Standing There. You hear a lot more of George's guitar, like a lot more of it. And some of George's guitar in that song, he's just hanging back there, kind of waiting for his lead moments. So he's just kind of scratching away. But those scratches were never meant to be forward.
Wow.
Lennon's playing was forward. And then George comes forward to fill in the gaps, between the vocal parts. So he's just kind of like scratching, like, here comes my, and now Benedict lick. And
Yeah.
then
Whose call was
holding,
that? Was it George Martin that made the call in the remixing?
well, Giles. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
These are choices, they're choices that they made.
Hmm.
And again, it's interesting to hear the whole thing that he did, but it was also never intended that we hear the whole thing that they did. Um, uh,
Speaking of,
you're creating an illusion when you make a recording. Recording is, even a live recording is not live.
yeah.
You're creating an illusion, and for most artists, that illusion is meant to be um, the best of them.
Speaking of guitars and how they sound, and then we'll get back to the Beatles music, but I am a huge Van Halen fan, and they were one of the bands on that first album. You hear Eddie's guitar all on one channel. Like, what was the thought process of that? Because it's strange to hear, then as the years went on, it was more full sound. You'd hear the guitars in both channels. But it was like guitars in one channel and then just the echo of that guitar on the other side. Ted Templeman was the producer for those.
Yeah,
And
those choices are a lot about the picture you want to present to the listener, and and many producers would argue that mono directional sounds come across as more live. They have a more of a live feel because as a listener, you go like, "There's that guitar right over there."
okay.
And there's that, and there's that backing vocal over there, and there's that violin, over there. And so it draws your attention to those things. And with a small band, with a three or four-piece band, Van Halen essentially a three-piece band, right?
Yeah.
That's not unheard of at all. That the way that you set up a three-piece band on tape or for a recording is I've got my drums taking up a good portion of the mid frame of my stereo field, and I'll throw my bass to the left and my guitar player to the right, and you always know where they are.
Eddie thought he thought his car stereo was broken when he first heard it. Banging the speaker, it's not working.
And then it's very common to break that a little bit and to add just a little bit more unified depth by either a little bit of a delay on that guitar that's in the exact opposite channel, or a little bit of reverb on it. But for many, many, many listening experiences, that doesn't matter that much, because once you get a certain distance away from your stereo, if you're if like behind me here, you've got stereo monitors here in this vintage EMI Studios mixing room.
I love it. Yeah.
If you back off of these monitors, if you walk away from these monitors, not the position that my friend over here is in,
Oh yeah.
but if you,
Folks only listen to the audio version. You have to go to YouTube. Yeah.
Get to work, buddy.
Who is that? Do you know who that guy is? Yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll
I don't
know.
know, but he wasn't paid enough. um, we never are.
I love it.
But if you step away far enough from that, that image there, you get a mono image. So a lot of the way that we experience music in the world, and even in our homes, again, unless we're sitting right between those speakers, we experience it in mono. And so what's most important are the overall volume relationships between the different sounds rather than the placement of them. necessarily.
From 1964's Beatles for Sale, we have 8 Days a Week. Interesting notes on this one. We hear a fade-in the beginning, a rare choice for the era. I've always wondered what led to a song, just in general, having a slow fade-in. Why was it decided here? Do you know why they decided to do that?
I don't know why, but if you think about it again in context of its time, and you think about it in context of AM radio, and you think about it in context of an AM radio DJ, having this little roll up to get people excited and to introduce the song, right? It gives them all of that. It gives you as a DJ the opportunity to,
hit the post.
And here's the Beatles with 8 days a week. Ooh, I need you, right?
That's a hit the post, baby. That's the old top 40 radio thing. You got to hit the post.
Yeah.
That's cool. So maybe it was just designed, for.
Could have very well been designed just for that purpose, to allow for that kind of drama. Because for a DJ, that's a fun thing to be able to do, right?
Yeah, and I always thought maybe it was just the band was jamming and they just started rolling tape and then you fade up. But I mean that could be in other examples, but in this it's likely it's designed for the DJs. Yeah, the next album is 1965's Help. On Yesterday, we really get an idea of how important George Martin was to the Beatles sound here. Can you talk about the string quartet arrangement and how this is the one where he makes that call? Like he excludes the drums, the bass, guitar solo, and backing vocals. It's like check your egos at the door, right?
Oh, it really was. And to me, this was a real turning point in terms of the maturity of the Beatles as recording artists. If ever there was a demonstration of what we're going to do here is serve the song, what's best for the song, Yesterday is the first absolutely clear example of, I know you're a band, I know there's 4 guys in the Beatles, we could probably do an arrangement of this where everyone gets a chance to play, but that's not what's best for this song. And Martin advocated for that, and the Beatles, bought into it. And I think it opened up their thinking and changed their thinking going forward about what it meant to be a Beatles song. All of a sudden, almost anything could be a Beatles song as long as they all had a say, they had a voice, but they didn't need to have a performance. They just needed to have a voice.
Is this the song that was played with the drums and guitar and bass live in Germany? Or am I thinking of a different song?
Yesterday?
Yeah, there was a song.
I'm trying to think of I more in my head the Tokyo performance.
Okay. I feel like, and look, there are Beatles fans out there that's probably they're like they know the answer to this.
Yeah,
but
leave it in the comments.
Leave it in the comments because I know it was on YouTube, and it was like a rare instance of where the whole band's playing it, but on the studio it's different. It's not including all the guys in the band. So there you go. Yeah, leave it in the comments. We'll get some answers on that one. Yeah, 65's Rubber Soul, which includes Norwegian Wood, and this is the debut of the sitar. You say there's a lesson to easily translate to today's music making on this song with its use of the sitar. It's an example of choosing unusual sounds and textures. Can you explain this? I think I have a quote from the book here too. You say, over time, we've come to associate the sound of a sitar in pop music as an artifact of the 60s Western youth culture's embrace of Eastern spiritualism. But here in its debut, it's more an example of choosing unusual sounds and textures. This lesson easily translates to today's music making. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the idea with the sitar was that it was not only something that George was interested in and starting to get excited about as an instrument, but it lent an atmosphere to the track that wasn't there before and wouldn't be there without it. Norwegian Wood would not sound the same without that instrument. And for modern music makers, there can be one or two choices that you make in your arrangement or your instrumentation that that are sounds that aren't familiar, and those are opportunities to really pique your listeners' interest. There was an era when uh, I think I want to say it's in the 70s, where one of the kind of the production goals of everyone that I was exposed to and people that I'm working with was um, I want a sound that no one's heard before. I want a sound on this song that no one has heard before. And so you'd mess up an existing sound, or you'd find a new patch for your modular synthesizer, something that you could wire together, or you'd use some unusual percussion instrument, or you record something backwards or sideways or whatever it happens to be, to get sounds that hadn't been heard yet. And again, these are things that if you use them wisely within your arrangement, your instrumental arrangement, you can get a lot of mileage from just one different voice that comes in. And Norwegian Wood's to me is a great example of that one voice that comes in that catches you in a different way, and that's the sitar in this case.
Is Rubber Soul where you start to get the revolutionary, ahead of its time Beatles around this point? Or is it more, I know Revolver gets a lot of credit for being like the first quote unquote classic rock sounding album. It's like that's the sound of classic rock.
Yeah, I would hang that more on Revolver than Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul is sort of the perfection of the early era of Beatles work. It's it's just a kind of a little, it's like a pop masterpiece of that school of writing, that school of playing, that kind of limited instrumentation approach. When you get to Revolver, all of a sudden they've broken out of the 4-track. They're needing on a routine basis to do these tape reduction remixes and have more than 4 tracks of audio in order to capture their ideas. They're still with Rubber Soul, they are still predominantly getting their ideas out within those 4 tracks that they were working with.
It is amazing though how quickly they evolved and progressed. You're talking about from like 63, like 2-3 years time, all of a sudden, boom, they're on their way. Like all of a sudden it's experimentation and all these things that they do. And
it was
such short time.
Yeah, it was happening all around them. And we tend to look at the Beatles out here in 2024 as an island of pop music in the 60s, and they weren't by any means. They were part of a bigger scene, and and within that scene you had lots of artists that were experimenting, and they were exposed to lots of types of music. They were just reflecting that back in their own way. And because they were the biggest band in the world, a lot of consumers believed that those ideas were born with the Beatles. But they were just part of the fabric of music that was going on then. They were a big part of the fabric of it. But like any artist today, it's the same story. You don't have to think too far back when early 2000s, when Coldplay was dominating the charts. And if I guarantee you listen to a cross section of pop music from 2002 to 2007, and you think about it, you're going to hear Coldplay all over it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's a healthy competition, but it's also, yeah, this sounds working, so let's make that sound. But also, like with the Beatles, when they heard Pet Sounds, it's like, well, we got to do something. We got to step it up. So that's what's cool about that era in the '60s is like everybody's listening to everybody else and just saying, boy, look what they're doing. We got to
And it
do
was,
something better.
and again, I just have, I have a kind of a positive belief on this, that as artists, we love that. We love when other people are doing cool things, and we want to do cool things too. And when you hear someone do something that's like, oh, oh, I love that. So, I love that. What can I do? What can I do either like that or in the spirit of that? Now, you had you had the Stones after the Beatles that always seemed like a fast following sort of act, right? In many cases, you know, following them into the pop stuff and the writing in the early days, right? After they, first they're a blues band, but then they're a more of a pop band. They start writing their own tunes. The tunes they're writing are trying to keep up with the Beatles. You have the most obvious one of her Satanic
Yeah.
Majesty's Request after Pepper comes out.
Yeah.
But I was even thinking the other day of, didn't Beggar's Banquet come out the year that the White Album came out? Was it
Ooh,
60?
yeah. You're right. Well, yeah, because it's after the Beatles break up that the Stones start to really pick up steam and you hear that classic Stone sound. But yeah, Beggar's Banquet would have been, let's see, Beggar's Banquet came out in '68. Yeah, that
Yeah,
came out in December of
so
'68.
even here, Beggar's Banquet is a White Album. So,
Yeah.
all of these guys were playing off of each other, and they're influenced by each other. They're influenced by the sounds they're making. The Beatles, um, they knew what was going on in San Francisco during the 67, 67, 66, 67. They knew what was happening there. They were bringing their own version of it into Revolver and Pepper, right? They knew what the Beach Boys were doing. They knew what was coming out of there. Um, Capitol Records had a relationship with EMI Records, so they had access to these things, and they were friends with these guys.
Yeah.
And again, that goes on, and that goes on to this day. Um, and it's a wonderful thing. None of this is done in isolation. No art's made in isolation. We all, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say. We all are. And yeah, so the Beatles weren't the giants. The Beatles were standing on shoulders too.
Yeah, well they were inspired by Buddy well, Chuck Berry
Yeah.
and Buddy Holly
Oh
too.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And they
that's
and the
Elvis.
Elvis,
Yeah.
the girl groups, they love, like, the Shirelles and the Marvelettes, and they love that stuff. And yeah, their early stuff is, there's lots of girl group stuff going on there, Motown stuff that they loved. Um, uh, again, they reflected it back to us. I'm sure you've read in many books about the Beatles that idea that they reflected early American rock and roll back to us in a way that we had forgotten about. The energy that was present in, Gene Vincent and in Carl Perkins and Elvis, that had been forgotten, after Elvis went to war, and Perkins got in an accident, and Buddy Holly died, and you know that had been forgotten. The Beatles brought us back that energy, and they brought it back sometimes or many times in the form of cover songs of American, pop from that early era.
Yeah. Yeah, what was the first song they was the first single they released? What was that a cover song? Um
For the Beatles,
yeah, what was the very
no,
first?
"Love Me Do" was their
Oh, that was the
was
very
their
first. Okay.
very first song.
Okay.
And then, yeah, "Love Me Do," "Please Please Me." But again, they did cover acts. They covered loads of loads of early rock and roll.
Yeah.
When they ran out of of original songs come Beatles for Sale, they broke open the Carl Perkins catalog and yeah, Honey Dote all of a sudden shows up, right? And Matchbox shows up, and yeah, that's just couldn't be any clearer that what they're that they were influenced. They weren't just the influencers, they were influenced. It's just that the Beatles had a way of taking those things, taking those influences and making something greater out of them.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jerry Hammack is here to talk about his brand new book, The Beatles Recording Techniques. So we move on to Revolver from 66. Tomorrow Never Knows is the one song I want to ask you about. That seems, it's a song that many artists have covered, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, like Phil Collins covered it, Living Colour covered it, David Lee Roth, I remember, covered it in one of his solo albums. And it's a song constructed around two chords. And it
Which makes it pretty easy to cover.
Right, exactly. And it doesn't sound like anything that would be considered a masterpiece, yet it is. Can you share with us all the things that we're hearing on this track?
Well, what makes it exceptional in terms of a recording is the use of the tape loops. And this originated in what was known as the musique concrète movement, where you're using found sounds and industrial sounds, and you're and in this case primarily found sounds, to create texture, to create movement, to create percussion. And the Beatles, again, knowing what was going on the avant-garde of music with this, brought that into their pop music. The backing groove for Tomorrow Never Knows sounds like a tape loop.
Yeah.
It sounds like a drum loop or something like that. But it's not. It's not. It's live.
Yeah. Props to Ringo on that one.
Oh, it's great. It's just such a deep groove. But yeah, what makes it unique is the fact that it's this drone that has all of these unexpected textures and all these unexpected sounds that come up to catch your attention and fill the void, right? Yeah, just realized in a completely original way for pop music of that era. That was the first song that they recorded for the Revolver sessions. Go figure that. Yeah, that was the one they started with, and that's where they started.
Wow. Yeah.
Again, as you were mentioning, to think of the strides in creativity that they made from album to album, it's remarkable. And yeah, Tomorrow Never Knows is just a wonderful example of that, of just throwing all expectations to the wind.
And by the time they stop touring, this is when it gets real interesting. By the end of August of 66, they played that last show in San Fran, right? Candlestick Park, San Francisco. And now they're going to say, let's just use all of our time. This is kind of like with Brian Wilson. When Brian Wilson gets off the road, it's like, that's when he really takes off too. Cause it's like, okay, I'll be home writing my music and really focusing on that. All of my time is going to be put into the studio. And yeah, we get Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yeah, there was no need for them to be thinking about the songs now in relation to performing them. Then that was also a fundamental change.
So kind of like took just like it took limitations away from them. Like, we can do whatever we want. We don't have to worry about whether we can play this in concert.
Yeah, and certainly the technology wasn't there for them to do it. They were having on their last tour, they were playing like Nowhere Man live, and it was very challenging for them to play that and sing that live, because it was very much a studio construct. How finished that song was, and it was kind of hit and miss as a live performance. Well, they didn't have to worry about that anymore. They can make these songs as complicated, as dense, as odd and wonderful as they wanted to, because they weren't even thinking about ever performing them.
Yeah.
The recording was the performance.
Yeah. And there's some equipment you talk about that they start using that's not available to the general public, like the EMI RS56 curve bender EQ.
Yeah.
So
So,
what's
uh,
that?
the first thing to understand is, and I'll jump back here to my buddy back here on the mixing
There he
console.
is.
Uh,
He doesn't want to
if
turn
you look
around and say
there,
hello. He's shy.
yeah, he's hard. He's at work and he knows he won't get paid if I doesn't keep at it. Um, those early consoles, and this is a very early one, not the Beatles were a little more advanced than this, but the early consoles had very limited tone controls on them. Almost, you could really think of them as if you have a stereo receiver and you've got a treble and a bass knob on a stereo receiver. That's pretty much what they had to sculpt sound on their recording consoles of that era. Uh, uh, when it came to doing the cutting of a tape to disc, though, they needed more fine control. And this equalization unit called an RS56 or curve bender was designed for mastering engineers to be able to uh, equalize a finished recording so it sounded as good as it could when it got cut to disc. Well, the Beatles were able to use it as they were recording on the front end of the recording, and that gave them a much broader spectrum then of sounds that they could use. So one of the problems that you get with sound is you get crowding and overlapping, because many instruments, especially pop instruments, they share a similar frequency range. And so if you've got a bunch of guitars going and the Beatles were recording through the same amps, right? You've got all this tonal similarity there, and you lose the distinction of the parts. Well, what an equalizer like that curve bender allowed them to do was to be able to pull apart and make gaps for this guitar to fit in where that guitar wasn't. And now I can really hear both guitars, even in mono. I can hear everything they're doing because that piece of equipment allowed me to carve out spaces and make room for things and highlight other things.
Interesting. That's like a new
Yeah.
toy, man. They must have loved
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and the spirit was simply to make great recordings, and that was the next step in making great recordings. Um, is that we can hear everything we intend to hear.
How about on a day in the life? You write about they make a sound that is bigger than it naturally was. An example
Yeah.
being the orchestral crescendos. Talk about that.
Yeah, so they had a 41-piece orchestra that they hired to come in and do those crescendos and do the string parts on a day in life. There's a couple of different string sections in there, including the whirlwind windup. Um, so that's a 41-piece orchestra. That's a pretty good sized studio orchestra. But for the Beatles, that wasn't big enough for that moment, and so they recorded it. They recorded that orchestra doing that windup there, uh, uh, both before the woke up, got out of bed part, and at the end of the track. They they had the orchestra perform that, and they recorded it 4 times, 4 different performances of it. And of course, you're never doing it quite the same way each time that you do it. So what you've got the equivalent there is of a 164-piece orchestra
That's so awesome.
is making that sound. Yeah.
That is awesome. Yeah. Man. Yeah. Well, from 67, we also get an album called Magical Mystery Tour.
Yeah.
On I Am the Walrus, you write, quote, this song demonstrates how a couple choices and some luck can change the direction of a song dramatically. What are those changes on I Am the Walrus?
Well, the the big choices in that from to my ears are that they really leaned into the electric piano. They leaned into the distortion of Lennon's vocal. Lennon's vocal is not pretty at all on I Am the Walrus. It's dirty, it's distorted, it's narrow, it's an ugly tone. And they absolutely lean into that. And then the orchestral arrangement that is thrown into it is also this sort of angsty toned, angsty voiced sort of orchestral piece that's arranged to it. All of those things give you that disturbing psychedelia. The luck comes when they tag on at the very end of the process. They tag on the radio broadcast, and when they were doing this, they were just scanning the radio bands to try to find something interesting as they were running a mix. Each time they were running the mix, they were scanning radio bands to try to find something that they thought was cool. They just happened to catch the Shakespeare performance. They just happened to catch that little bit of King Lear. It wasn't, okay, let's reel it up to here. We've got that recording of King Lear, and now I want to hear, Bury My Body. No, that just happened.
A happy accident, another happy accident.
Happy accident that they caught. And that was a little bit of luck that got them that. But there were very purposeful choices in how ugly that song sounds, in the harshness of that really reflects, some very dark lyrics, yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye. That's as far from, please, please me like I please you as you can get. And again, they're using their arrangements, they're using the choices to reinforce those moments.
The White Album from '68, where you say new solutions weren't pushing the Beatles sounds in this era as much as how they adapted the ones already at their disposal. So I ask you, can you expand on that and how they apply that to the White Album?
Yeah, so the White Album, there was no great introduction to technology. They did get an 8-track recorder about midway through the session, but a lot of the session was still done on 4-track. So there's a bit of a misperception that the White Album is an 8-track album. I think a little under half of it ended up being 8-track, recorded to 8-track. So they were using the same tool sets that they had been using, since Revolver. They were using the same tool sets to make the White Album as they were using, back in '66. Here, and remember, we're only talking 2 years later.
Yeah.
So, not a great advancement in technology. It's how they recombined and used it. It's how they used the tools to do the job that they wanted to do. So now they were using what was called vari-speed, which is where you slow or speed up the tape deck as you're recording or you're playing back in order to change the pitch of an instrument, which changes the tone of an instrument or a vocal. They're using that in a very sophisticated way. They're using artificial double tracking across multiple instruments. They're embracing distortion. They're pushing their gear in a way that they hadn't before. Nothing's new, but the way they're using it is new. Let's give an example of the single revolution from this era.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that is as hard a rockin' song as you're ever going to hear. And there isn't a single amplifier used on it.
Yeah. Tell me how they get that sound, that fuzzy sound. This is the REDD console.
Yeah.
Is used.
It's a Red 51 console was used on it. And this console, a lot like the one my friends got back here, is it's tube based, like a tube amp. So it's got, it had I want to say that 20 tube amplifiers in it. It had a lot of tube amplifiers in it, like enough that you could keep a meal warm on it.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but the inputs where you put microphone, run microphones into it, they were essentially tube amplifiers, like a guitar tube amplifier. So they just plugged their guitars directly into the board, and then they overloaded it. They overloaded their inputs, and they got this, and then they got this really unique kind of distortion.
Like almost like an
By
overmodulation type of thing. When the mics run hot, you get a little distortion.
you get distortion if you push too much signal across. If you're pushing too much input signal,
Right.
you'll get distortion. It's the basis of distortion in amplifiers or pedals or things like that. You're cranking, an input, and you're overloading the circuit. In this case, it's a tube circuit, tube based circuit. Valves, they call them over across the way. But if you think of it in that light, it's essentially a tube amplifier, and they're cranking the input into the tube amplifier, and so they're distorting it. And now you've got what sounds like a great distorted amplifier, but there's no amplifier involved at all. And they did it on everything. They did it for the guitars, they did it for the vocal, they did it for the bass.
So cool.
And when it came time to release the song, EMI was like, we can't release this song. It's all distorted.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
And
Is this a mistake?
yeah. And the Beatles' reaction was, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we wanted.
Pushing it to the extreme.
But
That's
again,
the vibe of the song. It's
yeah, but again, there's no new magic piece of gear going on here. This is what they've been using. They use the red consoles from the very start of their career to the end of their career, and they're just using it in a unique way. And I think that's a great lesson again for engineers and producers that are trying to embrace this, embrace the way the Beatles made music. Was you take what you've got and you figure out how you can use it in a new way, or combine it in a new way with something else that you've already got. There isn't some new toy that you're always looking for to get the sound that you want. It's just use the things at hand and try to think of ways that you can get something different out of them. And the Beatles were just masterful at that.
Yeah, REDD. I would say you say red. It's all caps. Does it stand for something? Oh, here it is. Recording Engineer Development Department.
Yeah,
that's what it stands for. Yeah.
So for those that don't know, there was a division of EMI called Hayes, and they manufactured a lot of the gear that the Beatles worked on, they recorded through. And that included the consoles, the tape recorders that you see back here. These were all in-house designs. And the mixing console back there, these were all things that were designed by EMI, manufactured by EMI, and used by EMI to make hit records.
Yeah, the red, I'm looking at a picture on Wikipedia, and it's like something you'd see in Lost in Space or Star Trek. It's so cool, man. So cool. Yeah. Let It Be is next, recorded January of 69, released May of 70. For the title track, Phil Spector he keeps the stereo field of the song narrow and centered until the chorus, where it breaks out wide. You also note how dominant the guitar solo is in relation to the backing track, completely altering the track's dynamics. Now, I'm interested in what you think of the naked version of that song, the album that Paul released in 2003, because that version removes Spector's embellishments. What do you think of the '03 version? Do you like it? Do you prefer more, or did you like the Phil Spector version?
Well, I grew up with the Spector version. I grew up with it. I only learned later, like a lot of us did, of Paul's strenuous objections to, although he let it be released.
Right.
They'd say it was too late, but was it too late? I don't know. I don't mind the specterizing of Let It Be as much as I think most people do. I find the naked tracks to be they're an interesting artifact to me. They're uh, they're not superior in any way to my to my ears. They're you could look at them as that's the pure Beatles and look at them through that intellectual light. But performance wise, feel uh, what they evoke in you. I don't. It's not any stronger than anything I ever got out of the Let It Be album that that Spector got his hands on.
And that's what
Um,
fans made an emotional attachment to. So that's the one they're going to prefer, I think. Even if you say, "Oh, this naked version sounds better," you still have that attachment to the original version.
yeah, and the Naked, people also need to remember that when Naked came out, it was also of a fashion. It came out in the unplugged era, right? So, lest we forget the unplugged era when, it was all the rage to sit around with acoustic guitars and play acoustic versions of electric songs.
Clapton's Layla, man. Yeah.
Yeah,
MTV Unplugged.
Nirvana.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and there's certainly a fondness for those things. There's an idea that makes them purer, that makes them more real, but it's just another version of the track. Um, I think if you really want to understand what was going on with the Beatles prior to Spector, you need to listen to the Glyn Johns mixes of the Let It Be work. They were never accepted by the Beatles, but it gives you, I think, a much closer idea of what's there on the original 8-track reels for the Let It Be album.
Did you get to read Glyn Johns' book? I have that.
Yeah, Soundman.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Great book.
yeah. Doesn't talk a lot about the Beatles, but
Right. I know. Yeah. Yeah. He could have certainly written much more. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, he had a job because Apple Studios was not ready to record them. And they had to haul in all of this, gear from EMI, 2 of these red consoles in order to facilitate the 8-track, which is George's 8-track. George Harrison's personal 8-track. They had wires going through the doorways to get out to the studio because they didn't have a proper patch bay. Glyn Johns had a lot to overcome to make that album, and they also, they went into that. Something I talk about in the book is they went into that with like a mission statement. That mission statement being, we're only going to record what the 4 of us, turned out to be 5 of us, can play live. And that was their intent going in, but that's not the album that came out of it. The album that came out of it was still comprised of a lot of edits. In fact, the Get Back song is not the rooftop performance that we'd all like to believe we're hearing, that ends with, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group." It's a studio performance.
The whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing. It's a studio performance. And Spector pasted Lennon's dialogue from the film to the end of it to make it feel like it was live.
Mm.
It's an illusion, like all recordings.
Well, yeah, just talking to an author of a book on Prince's Purple Rain, and we were talking about the Minnesota Vikings football game. The cheering is at the end of the song Purple Rain because they wanted to enhance the sound of the applause at the end.
Yeah, it's all an illusion.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Well, that was a big thing, live albums. How live were they? And they Kiss Alive, turns out, wasn't all that. I think only the drums were taken from the show.
Yeah. It's the rare artist that doesn't want to be seen in their best light. They just want to be seen in their best light.
Yeah. Just winding down a few more here. I want to ask about It's All Too Much, which is one of my favorite Beatles songs. That's from the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, also released in 69. Beautiful mix with a guitar and church-like organ, but what is it that pulsating percussion sound that comes in and out of that track? It sounds like an army marching. What is that?
It's all too much.
It's all too much. It's it sounds
there's some backward percussion that's going on in that. So
okay.
It's
and it fades in and out too. It's not
yeah,
there.
So it's the percussion track that's been flipped. And so, the transients are flipped, of course, then too. Decay and attack relationships are changed. You get decay before attack. And that's the way that they did that trick. It's a reverse. Again, nothing new in the Beatles world. They've been reversing audio since Rain. And here we are on, I think 68 they recorded It's All Too Much, even though it came out later
right.
on Yellow Submarine soundtrack. Yeah, it's reversed percussion track, recorded backwards, and then, as you noted, then brought in and out of the mix.
Yeah, it just fades in, fades out. Yeah. Abbey Road released in 69. A great observation on the song Something that I'm hoping you can share. You note the placement of certain parts and tones that a lot of modern pop songs have. How did the Beatles demonstrate here that you can place those elements wherever you want? It's something you talk about in the book.
Yeah. Now, Abbey Road's a thoroughly modern recording, and it stands up to to any modern recording. It was done on a what anyone would feel would be a contemporary mixing console, the TG 12345 console. It was a solid state board. They had discrete control over all of the inputs on it, meaning they had tonal control for EQ. They had dynamic control for like compression or limiting if they chose to use it. That gives you a fineness of sound that that they didn't have previously. And additionally, they were able to use the full, on every channel, they could use the full 180 degrees of the stereo sound field. And any element then could be assigned to any portion of that or any point within that sound field. And they used that in bringing the songs to life. Again, a very modern way of, hey, look over here at 2 o'clock is that string section. And now over here at, at 9 o'clock, I've got that guitar solo comes in. They could do all of those things that we don't even think about nowadays.
The Beatles Recording Techniques, it's out now, right? Book came out, I think it came out, was it in April that it was released?
Yeah, April 23rd.
Yeah, late April. Yeah. So it's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. And Jerry, where can people find you online? You have a website, don't you?
I've got a few of them.
Okay.
JerryHammack.com if you want to learn about the work that I do in music. There's the Beatles Recording Techniques.com for the new book if you want to get an overview, and it'll give you a great kind of primer of what's in the book. And then if you're interested in the previous books, Beatles Recording Reference Manuals with an S.com will point you to those 5 volumes that walk through their entire catalog.
Thanks so much, Jerry. This was fascinating, and I grilled you on some Beatles questions, and you answered them all. So.
Did my best. Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate your time and being able to speak to you today. I love talking Beatles.